The massive council chamber stretched out like a metal cathedral, its walls lined with delegates from dozens of alien species. The air hummed with translator devices working overtime as heated arguments erupted in languages that sounded like everything from musical chimes to grinding rocks. At the center of it all, a holographic display showed something that made even the bravest warriors shift uncomfortably in their seats. 3 star systems. Gone. Not destroyed in some epic battle or consumed by a dying star. Simply erased. Where billions of beings once lived, worked, and dreamed, there was now only empty space and drifting debris. Ambassador Lee Hyun adjusted his simple black uniform and watched the chaos unfold around him. Unlike the elaborate armor and ceremonial robes worn by other delegates, his clothing was plain, almost boring. No medals, no ceremonial weapons, no glowing crystals or technological implants. Just a middle-aged human sitting quietly while the galaxy's mightiest civilizations shouted at each other. The Zephyrians were impossible to miss. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales that shifted color based on their emotions, they dominated one entire section of the chamber. Their leader, Commander Veltar, had scales blazing bright red with fury as he pounded his massive fist against the speaking podium. The sound echoed like thunder. "The Zephyrian Empire has ruled the Outer Rim for 3,000 years, he roared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never lost a battle. Our warships are feared across 50 systems. These machine invaders will learn what happens when they challenge true warriors." Murmurs of approval rippled through several delegations. The Zephyrians had quite a reputation. Their fleet was massive, their weapons advanced, and their warriors trained from birth for combat. If anyone could stop these mysterious devourers, surely it would be them. But then the Vorthak representative spoke, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The Vorthak looked like living crystal formations, beautiful but cold, their voices creating harmonies that somehow managed to sound both musical and threatening at the same time. Battle prowess alone will not suffice. The crystal being chimed, each word ringing like a bell. This enemy has consumed entire civilizations. We must think strategically, not emotionally. The Vorthak's form pulsed with a soft blue light as it continued. However, certain species should not be trusted with frontline duties. The humans, for instance, have a documented history of avoiding direct confrontation. All eyes turned to the human section. Ambassador Lee felt the weight of thousands of alien gazes, some curious, others dismissive, many openly hostile. He had expected this. Humanity's reputation in the galaxy was complicated. "They negotiate when they should fight," continued another voice, this one belonging to a Draknari delegate, whose skin looked like polished obsidian. "When the hegemony wars broke out, where were the humans? Sitting at peace tables. When the Void Raiders attacked the trade routes, what did humanity do? Offered to mediate. They call it diplomacy. We call it cowardice." Laughter erupted from several sections of the chamber. Not friendly laughter, but the cruel kind that cuts deep. Ambassador Lee had heard it all before. In the 50 years since, humanity had joined the galactic community. They had built a reputation as the species that always looked for the peaceful solution. The ones who would rather talk than fight. The ones who backed down when things got serious. General Kang slowly rose from his seat. At 65, he was one of the most experienced military officers humanity had ever produced, though his weathered face and simple uniform made him look more like a grandfather than a warrior. His voice was quiet when he spoke, forcing the chamber to fall silent to hear him. "The Republic of Earth will serve wherever the Council believes we can be most useful," he said simply. "We're here to help, not to argue about glory." The reaction was immediate and brutal. The Draknari delegate actually threw back his head and laughed. "Listen to that. Wherever we can be most useful. No talk of honor, no promises of victory, no fire in their bellies at all." "Typical human response," sneered a Kelhari representative, her fur bristling with disdain. "Always looking for the easy job, the safe position. Some things never change." Captain Park Ji-ho sat in the back row of the human delegation, his tablet displaying fleet positions and supply chain logistics. He was quietly running calculations, estimating response times and resource requirements. But he could hear every insult being thrown at his species. His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept working. As the session continued, defensive assignments were handed out like pieces of a puzzle. The Zephyrians received the honor of first contact, their massive fleets positioned at the outer defense perimeter. The Vorthak would coordinate the second wave with their advanced tactical computers. The Draknari took point defense around major population centers. And humanity? They were assigned to rearguard supply duties, logistics, transportation, keeping the coffee hot and the ammunition flowing while the real warriors did the fighting. Ambassador Lee simply nodded his acceptance while around him, alien delegates smirked with satisfaction. The cowards had been put in their proper place, but Captain Park noticed something the others missed. As Lee nodded, he tapped 3 fingers against his knee. An old military signal that meant, "Understood, will comply, stand ready." The reputation was about to be tested. The silence in space was always eerie, but today it felt different. Lieutenant Kim Sora stood on the bridge of the HSS Harmony, a small frigate that was considered outdated by galactic standards. Through the reinforced viewing port, she could see the defensive line stretched across the void like a glittering necklace of warships. Zephyrian dreadnoughts floated like massive metal mountains, their hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Vorthak crystal ships hung in perfect geometric formations, their surfaces reflecting starlight in rainbow patterns. It was beautiful. It was also about to become a graveyard. "Contact in 30 minutes, announced Ensign Choi Min-ho from his position, at the sensor array. The young officer's voice was steady, but Sora could see his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the controls. "Whatever's coming, it's big. Really big." The first sign wasn't visual. It was the sensors going crazy, displays flickering with readings that didn't make sense. Gravity waves rippled through space itself, causing even the massive Zephyrian ships to shift position slightly. Then the stars began to disappear, not fade or dim but simply vanish, blocked out by something so enormous that it defied comprehension. The Devourers didn't emerge from hyperspace so much as reality seemed to tear open and vomit them into normal space. They were nothing like the sleek, organic curves of most alien ships or even the functional angles of human vessels. These things looked like they had been designed by a mathematician having a nightmare. Perfect geometric shapes connected by impossible angles, surfaces that seemed to bend light around them, and a size that made the largest Zephyrian dreadnought look like a toy boat next to an aircraft carrier. The lead vessel alone was easily 50 kilometers long, its hull covered in what looked like millions of tiny hexagonal panels that pulsed with an internal light. "By all the gods," whispered Communications Officer Lee Dae-ho, forgetting to maintain proper bridge discipline. "How do you fight something like that?" Commander Veltar apparently thought he knew the answer. The Zephyrian battle cry echoed across all frequencies as their armada surged forward, weapon systems charging with the distinctive whine of plasma cannons and particle beams. Their ships moved in perfect formation, a wall of firepower that had conquered dozens of worlds. Sora watched through her ship's external cameras as the first salvo lit up space. Thousands of energy beams lanced out from the Zephyrian fleet, enough firepower to glass a small moon. The weapons struck the lead Devourer ship and did absolutely nothing. The beams simply disappeared into those hexagonal panels like water, soaking into sand. That should have been the first warning. Instead, the Zephyrians pressed their attack, closing distance and increasing their rate of fire. Their warrior culture didn't allow for retreat, only victory or glorious death in battle. They caught death, but there was nothing glorious about it. The Devourer ships didn't return fire in any conventional sense. Instead, beams of pure energy erupted from points along their hulls, but these weren't weapons as most species understood them. They were more like surgical tools, precise beyond imagination. Where they touched Zephyrian ships, matter simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or vaporized, but removed from reality as if it had never been there at all. The proud Zephyrian dreadnought Conquest vanished piece by piece, its hull disappearing in perfect geometric cuts until the crew compartments were exposed to space. The screams over the communication channels lasted exactly 12 seconds before the ship's power core was surgically removed and the vessel died. "Zephyrian flagship is gone," reported Choi, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the warriors, pride, and gods, they're cutting through them like they're not even there." Within 2 hours, half the Zephyrian armada had been methodically disassembled. The survivors, including Commander Veltar himself, broadcast a full retreat order. Ships that had never fled from any battle now burned their engines to maximum, trying to escape the mechanical precision of the Devourers. But the geometric nightmares weren't finished. They turned their attention to the second defensive line, where the Vorthak crystal formations waited with their advanced tactical computers, calculating attack patterns and defensive strategies. The crystals lasted exactly 43 minutes. "Vorthak formations are shattering," Choi reported, his fingers flying over his instruments. "Whatever those beams are, they're disrupting the harmonic frequencies that hold their ships together. The entire second line is collapsing." Through the chaos of retreating ships and panicked communications, Sora watched species after species abandon their positions. The Draknari, who had boasted about their unbreakable will, fled after their flagship was carved into neat sections. The Kelhari didn't even engage, jumping to hyperspace the moment they saw what had happened to the Zephyrians. One by one, every brave species that had mocked humanity's cautious nature proved that courage was easy to claim when you weren't facing an impossible enemy. In the human section of the defensive line, Captain Park Ji-ho stood quietly on his bridge, reading the tactical reports with the same calm expression he'd worn during the council meeting. His ship, the HSS Determination, was a 15-year-old cruiser that had seen better days. His crew was smaller than most. His weapons were considered primitive by galactic standards, and his orders clearly stated he should remain in the rear guard. His communications officer held up a message pad. "Sir, Admiral Chen is ordering all human ships to fall back to the supply depot. We're supposed to begin evacuation procedures immediately." Park took the pad, read the order carefully, then deleted it from the ship's computer. The bridge crew stared at him in stunned silence. "Sir?" His tactical officer, Lieutenant Yoon, asked carefully. "The retreat order?" "Signal the fleet," Park said calmly, settling into his command chair. "All human vessels, adjust course. We're moving to the front lines." The communications officer's mouth fell open. "Sir, we weren't assigned to frontline combat. Our orders specifically—" Park looked at the young man with the patience of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "Someone has to," he said simply. Around them, the greatest military forces in galactic history were running for their lives. And humanity, the species everyone called cowards, was moving forward into the darkness. The emergency council session had descended into pure chaos. The grand chamber that once echoed with proud boasts and military strategy now rang with panicked voices and desperate pleas. Holographic displays showed red alerts across dozens of star systems as the Devourer fleet spread like a mechanical plague through the galaxy's outer rim. Ambassador Lee Hyun sat in his simple chair, watching alien representatives who had called his species cowards just days ago now screaming at each other in terror. The Zephyrian section was mostly empty now, their surviving ships limping back to home territory. The few remaining delegates had scales that flickered between gray and black colors that meant fear and shame in their culture. "This is madness," shrieked a Kelhari representative, her usually pristine fur matted with stress. 17 colonies have gone dark. Where are our evacuation fleets? Where is the protection we were promised? The Vorthak delegates' crystalline form pulsed an angry red. Our calculations showed a 73% probability of successful defense. This outcome was not anticipated in any scenario. That's when the shouting really started. Every species began pointing fingers, demanding to know why their brilliant military strategies had failed so spectacularly. The Draknari accused the Zephyrians of cowardice. The Zephyrians blamed the Vorthak for faulty intelligence. Everyone seemed to have an excuse for why they had run instead of fighting. Commander Veltar, the same Zephyrian who had boasted about crushing the machines, now stood with his head lowered in shame. But when the tactical display updated with new fleet positions, His scales flashed bright orange with confusion. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the arguing. "What are the humans doing at the front?" The chamber fell silent, as every delegate turned to stare at the tactical display. There, in the space where the most dangerous battles were raging, were the symbols representing human ships. Not retreating like everyone else, but actually advancing toward the Devourer fleet. "We ordered them to fall back," Veltar continued, his confusion evident. "Their assignment was rearguard supply duty. Why are they moving forward?" Before Ambassador Lee could respond, the main screen flickered to life. Admiral Han Jiwoo appeared, his weathered face streaked with soot and sweat. Behind him, the bridge of his ship shuddered as weapons fire impacted against the hull. Sparks flew from damaged consoles and emergency lights bathed everything in red. "Admiral Han," called out the council moderator, "you're ordered to retreat immediately. Your ships are not equipped for this level of combat." Han wiped blood from a cut on his forehead and looked directly into the camera. "We're buying time for civilian evacuations, all civilians, not just human ones." The Vorthak delegate's form flashed in disbelief. "You're completely outgunned. Your weapons are primitive compared to what we deployed. This is suicide." Another explosion rocked Han's ship, and he grabbed onto his command chair to keep from falling. When he straightened up, his expression was calm despite the chaos around him. "Maybe it is suicide," he admitted, his voice steady even as alarms blared in the background. "But someone needs to slow them down while the evacuation fleets get people to safety." The camera shook again, more violently this time. Through the bridge's viewing port, the council could see the geometric nightmare of a Devourer ship, firing its reality-cutting beams at Han's fleet. Human ships exploded in bright flashes, their crews dying to buy precious minutes for alien civilians to escape. "You don't understand," screamed the Kelhari delegate. "Those are our people you're dying for. Why would you sacrifice yourselves for species that aren't even allied with you?" Han's image flickered as his ship's power systems took damage. "Because they're people," he said simply. "That's enough." The transmission cut out, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. But the reports kept coming. On Kepler 442b, Major Yoon Seojin had been coordinating the evacuation of a Dreknari mining colony when the Devourers deployed ground forces. The same Dreknari who had sneered at human weakness were now fleeing in panic as geometric death machines carved through their defensive positions. Yoon had 63 human soldiers under her command. The Dreknari colony had 3 million civilians who needed to reach the evacuation transports. "Major Yoon, you need to pull back," came the frantic radio call from the evacuation coordinator. "The Devourer ground units are overwhelming your position." Yoon crouched behind the ruins of what had been a mining facility, watching her soldiers fall back in good order, while covering the endless stream of Dreknari families running toward the transport ships. Children cried in their parents' arms, while elderly Dreknari moved as quickly as their legs could carry them. "Negative," she replied, chambering another round in her rifle. "Transports are still loading. We hold this line until everyone's off-world." Her small garrison of human soldiers dug in and fought with everything they had. They used tactics the machines couldn't predict, turning mining equipment into improvised weapons and collapsing tunnels to create choke points. When their ammunition ran low, they fought with whatever they could find. When the machines adapted to their strategies, they improvised new ones. For 18 hours, 63 humans held off an army of machines that had conquered entire star systems. They didn't fight for glory or honor or recognition. They fought because 3 million people needed time to escape, and no one else was there to give it to them. The last transport lifted off with the final group of Dreknari civilians. "Major." Yoon's radio crackled one last time. "Major, the transports are clear. All civilians evacuated successfully. You did it." She smiled despite the exhaustion and blood loss. "Good. Tell them they're safe now." The transport ship that should have carried her and her remaining soldiers off-world had been destroyed by Devourer air units 6 hours earlier. There would be no rescue, no last-minute salvation. Yoon and her soldiers had known this for most of the battle, but they had stayed anyway. When the council received the after-action report, the chamber fell into a silence that seemed to stretch forever. 3 million Draknari civilians had reached safety because humans had stood in the path of an unstoppable enemy and refused to move. The same humans who had been called cowards were dying by the thousands to save people who had mocked them. They weren't asking for thanks or recognition or even basic respect. They were simply doing what they believed was right, because in their minds, someone had to stand between the darkness and those who couldn't protect themselves. The reputation was changing, one heroic sacrifice at a time. The human fleet had never been designed for this kind of warfare. Their ships were older, their weapons simpler, and their armor thinner than what the major galactic powers fielded. But as the Devourer war machine swept through system after system, something remarkable began to happen. The humans started fighting in ways that defied every military manual ever written. Captain Shin Woo-jin found himself commanding the HSS Perseverance in the Vega asteroid field, watching a convoy of Zephyrian refugee ships limping toward safety. The massive civilian transports were packed with families who had fled their homeworld when the Devourers arrived. Behind them, a Devourer harvester ship was gaining ground, its reality-cutting beams already reaching out to claim the fleeing vessels. "Sir, we can't match that thing's firepower," reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Kim Bo-ra. "It's 3 times our size and has enough weapons to level a city." Shin studied the tactical display, his mind racing through possibilities. The asteroid field around them was dense, full of rocks ranging from pebble size to mountain size. Most captains would consider it a navigation hazard. Shin saw an opportunity. "Plot a course through the thickest part of the field," he ordered. "Make it look like we're running scared." The Perseverance dove between massive asteroids, its hull scraping against rock faces as Shin pushed the ship through spaces barely wider than the vessel itself. The Devourer harvester followed, confident in its superior size and shielding. Its geometric hull easily brushed aside smaller asteroids that would have crushed Shin's ship. "Now," Shin whispered. The Perseverance suddenly reversed course, spinning around to face the harvester while firing everything it had, not at the enemy ship, but at the massive asteroid above it. The ancient rock, already weakened by millions of years of impacts, shattered like glass. Thousands of tons of debris crashed down onto the Devourer ship's hull, overwhelming its defensive systems. But it wasn't enough to stop the machine. Damaged, but still functional, the harvester began to turn its weapons on the refugee convoy. "All stop," Shin ordered quietly. "Prepare for ramming speed." His crew stared at him in shock. Lieutenant Kim spoke up, her voice shaking. "Sir, ramming that thing at full speed will destroy us completely." Shin nodded, watching the refugee ships on his screen. Thousands of Zephyrian families who had called humans cowards were now depending on those same humans for their lives. "I know, but it'll take that harvester with us and the convoy will make it to safety." The Perseverance accelerated directly toward the Devourer ship. At the last second, Shin armed every explosive device on his vessel, turning his ship into a massive bomb. The collision sent shockwaves through the asteroid field, completely destroying both ships. The refugee convoy escaped unharmed. 3 systems away, Commander Lee Min-jun faced an even more impossible situation. The Arcturus Gateway was the only escape route for 17 different evacuation fleets, a massive space station that could transport ships across vast distances in seconds. If it fell, millions of civilians would be trapped with no way to escape the advancing Devourers. Lee's destroyer, the HSS Resolute, was the only human ship in the area. Against him came not 1, but 5 Devourer assault ships, each one larger and more powerful than anything humanity had ever built. "Sir, we're receiving direct orders to abandon the gateway," reported his communications officer, Ensign Park Jae-sung. "Command says it's not worth losing more ships." Lee looked out at the streams of alien vessels fleeing through the gateway. Draknari merchant ships, Vorthak research vessels, even some Zephyrian military transports carrying wounded from the front lines. Every few minutes, another group would jump through to safety. "How many ships are still waiting to evacuate?" he asked. Park checked his sensors. 47 vessels, sir, mostly civilian transports." Lee settled into his command chair and activated the ship's defensive systems. "Then we stay until they're all through." The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most lopsided engagements in galactic history. One human destroyer against 5 Devourer assault ships. Lee fought with every trick he could think of, using the Gateway's gravitational field to slingshot his ship around the station while firing at impossible angles. He targeted the mechanical joints on the Devourer ships, looking for weak points that might not exist. His hull began to breach after the first hour. Life support failed after the second. By the third hour, half his crew was dead and the ship was held together by emergency patches and stubborn determination. "Last transport is through," Park called out, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "All evacuation ships have made it to safety." Lee smiled despite the blood running down his face. "Good. Send a message to the fleet. Tell them the Gateway is clear for demolition." He armed the Gateway's self-destruct sequence, ensuring the Devourers couldn't use it to follow the fleeing civilians. The massive station exploded just as the enemy ships moved in to capture it, taking Lee and his crew with it. But perhaps the most heartbreaking sacrifice came from Captain Omi Young of the HSS Defiant. She found herself surrounded by 6 Devourer vessels while escorting a Kelhari evacuation fleet. The same Kelhari who had vanished from the battlefield without firing a shot were now depending on a single human ship for protection. "We're completely surrounded," reported her tactical officer, his voice tight with fear. "They've got us in a perfect kill box." O studied her tactical display with the calm of someone who had already accepted her fate. The Kelhari ships were civilian transports packed with families and children. They had no weapons, no shields, and no way to defend themselves. "Arm the reactor for overload," she ordered quietly. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sound of enemy weapons charging. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Choi Sung-min, turned to her with tears in his eyes. "Captain, there has to be another way." O placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "There is no other way, and you know it. Those are innocent people out there. Someone has to give them a chance." She opened a channel to her family back on Earth, knowing it would be the last time she heard their voices. "Tell my family I was proud to serve," she said simply, then cut the transmission before anyone could respond. The HSS Defiant became a star for exactly 3 seconds. The explosion was so massive it created a temporary gap in the Devourer formation, allowing the Kelhari fleet to escape through the opening. 3 enemy ships were completely destroyed in the blast, and the remaining 3 were too damaged to pursue. Across the galaxy, the pattern repeated itself. Human ships sacrificing themselves not for glory or recognition, but simply to give others a chance to live. They never asked for help, never expected gratitude, and never hesitated when faced with impossible odds. The species that had been called cowards were proving that true courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and standing firm anyway, because someone had to stand between the darkness and those who couldn't protect themselves. The galaxy was beginning to understand what humanity had always known. Heroes aren't born from the absence of fear, but from the presence of love. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Lieutenant Bei Jin-woo was a junior communications officer aboard the HSS Harmony, the same small frigate where Lieutenant Kim Sora had first witnessed the Devourer arrival. Bei wasn't a tactical genius or a decorated war hero. He was a 24-year-old kid from Busan who had joined the Space Navy because he was good with computers and wanted to see the stars. But sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most ordinary people. Bei had been monitoring Devourer communications for weeks, trying to understand how their ships coordinated their attacks. The enemy vessels moved with perfect synchronization, like parts of a single vast organism. Every maneuver was calculated, every response predictable, every strategy built on pure mathematical logic. "It's like they're all connected to one giant brain," he told Sora during a brief rest between battles. "They share information instantly, calculate the most efficient response, and execute it without any hesitation or doubt." That's when it hit him. The Devourer's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. "What if we could overload that shared brain?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with sudden inspiration. "What if we gave it too much chaos to process all at once?" The idea was insane. Instead of fighting the Devourers with logical military tactics, They would attack with pure, unpredictable human madness. No battle plans, no coordinated strategies, no sensible formations, just dozens of human ships doing completely random, illogical things all at the same time. Admiral Han Ji-woo listened to Bei's proposal with the skeptical attention of a career military officer. His flagship, the HSS Indomitable, bore the scars of a dozen battles. Half his fleet was gone, and the survivors were running on spare parts and stubborn determination. "You want me to order our remaining ships to attack with no plan whatsoever?" Han asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not no plan, sir," Bei corrected. "A deliberately chaotic plan. Every ship does something different, something unexpected, something that makes no tactical sense. We overload their ability to predict and counter our moves." It went against everything Admiral Han had learned in 30 years of military service. But then again, everything about this war had defied conventional wisdom. Maybe it was time to try something completely different. The final battle began like no engagement in galactic history. Human ships scattered in all directions, some charging straight at enemy vessels, others retreating at random intervals, still others spinning in circles while firing their weapons at empty space. From the outside, it looked like complete madness. Captain Park Ji-ho, still commanding the HSS Determination, flew his ship in a perfect figure-8 pattern while launching all his escape pods in different directions. Captain Lim Yu-jin flew backwards into battle, her engines facing the enemy while she fired over her shoulder. Commander Kim Tae-ho started playing classical music over all frequencies, while his ship danced between Devourer formations like it was performing ballet. The Devourer's networked intelligence tried to analyze and counter each move, but there was nothing to analyze. Human behavior had no pattern, no logic, no predictable outcome. The machine consciousness began to overload, trying to calculate responses to actions that made no mathematical sense. Error messages cascaded through the Devourer network. Their perfect synchronization began to break down as individual ships started making conflicting decisions. Some vessels tried to attack multiple targets simultaneously. Others froze completely, unable to choose between equally illogical options. And then, like a house of cards collapsing, the entire network crashed. One by one, the geometric nightmare ships went dark. Their reality-cutting beams stopped firing. Their perfect formations scattered like leaves in the wind. The machines that had seemed unstoppable just moments before now drifted helplessly through space, their shared consciousness offline, and their individual units unable to function independently. The last Devourer ship flickered once and went silent. The galaxy fell quiet. After months of constant warfare, the sudden absence of battle was almost deafening. Human ships floated among the debris of their enemies, their crews hardly daring to believe what they had accomplished. In the rebuilt council chamber, representatives from across the galaxy gathered to witness something unprecedented. The species that had been dismissed as cowards now sat at the center of attention, their simple uniforms and quiet demeanor contrasting sharply with the elaborate displays of other civilizations. Commander Veltar was the first to break the silence. The proud Zephyrian warrior, his scales now a humble gray color, looked directly at Admiral Han with something that might have been shame in his eyes. We called you cowards," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Han stood slowly, his uniform still torn from the final battle, his face still streaked with soot from countless engagements. He looked tired, older than his years, but his eyes held a quiet strength that hadn't been there before the war began. "Fear doesn't make you a coward," he replied gently. "Running when others need you does." The Vorthak delegate's crystalline form pulsed with colors that had no translation, but somehow conveyed deep regret. "You knew you couldn't win," the being chimed softly. "Your ships were outgunned, your weapons primitive, your chances of survival minimal, yet you stayed." Captain Lim Yu-jin, the sole survivor of the Kepler defense, stepped forward. Her left arm was in a sling, and burn scars marked one side of her face, but she stood straight and proud. "Winning wasn't the point," she said simply. "Standing was." The chamber remained silent as her words sank in. These aliens had spent centuries conquering worlds, building empires, and measuring success in terms of territory gained and enemies defeated. The concept of fighting not to win but simply to protect others was foreign to most of them. Ambassador Li Hyun finally rose to address the council one last time. The same quiet man who had sat through mockery and insults now commanded the attention of every being in the chamber. Humanity doesn't fight for glory or conquest, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. We don't seek to build empires or impose our will on others. We fight because when everything falls apart, someone has to hold the line, especially if that someone is afraid. He paused, looking around the chamber at faces that now regarded humanity with something approaching awe. You called us cowards because we chose diplomacy over warfare, negotiation over conquest. You mistook our restraint for weakness, our caution for fear. But courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being terrified and standing firm anyway because others need you to. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of contempt or dismissal, but of understanding. For the first time, the galaxy began to comprehend what humanity had always known. That true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others. The reputation had changed forever. Humanity would never again be seen as the species that backed down from a fight. They were now known as the species that stood up when everyone else fell down, the ones who held the line when the line seemed impossible to hold. And in a galaxy that had forgotten the difference between being fearless and being brave, humanity had reminded everyone what real courage looked like. The war was over. The understanding had just begun.